We're going to get started, and before I give my opening statement, I want to briefly say that I, like all of our colleagues, to welcome back Ms. Castor from Florida. We look forward to her participation and welcome her back to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward
to formally welcome you back from your side of the aisle. I'm going to yield to Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Chairman, we have what we call the right of return on the Democratic side, and we have two members sitting on in the front row that have used the right of return. We're delighted that both of them are back, and I would especially welcome Kathy Castor. She is an excellent member of the committee. She has not served on this committee in the minority yet, but it won't be very long. And the right of return, and we expect the right of return to be exercised by the other Democrats who are waiting in line. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we are delighted to have her back and look forward to her participation. And I don't know, have you all decided the subcommittees yet that she's going to serve on? Okay. All right. Well, we're here. I'm going to start my opening statement. We're here this morning to talk about job creation. And we're here to talk about energy security and sensible regulation. In the first half of 2011, our pursuit of these goals has been unwavering and our successes many. Later today, we will vote on the semi-annual committee activity report. This document was produced as part of the transparency and accountability agenda of Speaker Boehner and the Republican majority. It is a public report on the work of the committee, and without a doubt, we have a great deal to report. Activity report is an inherently nonpartisan document. It simply chronicles the work of the committee. In the first 5 months of the 112th Congress, we held 52 days of hearings. We reported 12 bills and resolutions to the House, and it played a central role in important legislation that has gone straight to the House floor. The full committee alone has met for nearly 30 hours, and we have spent another 150 hours in subcommittee hearings and markups. After spending more than 180 hours in our committee rooms, my colleagues can understand as a Michigan Wolverine why I call this the big house, and our space upstairs, Wrigley Field. I was in the bleachers on Friday in the last row for a win. We named the rooms after places where I think everyone would like to spend a lot of time. This activity report listing the hours that we put in and the work that we've done is something all of us should be proud of, and I want to thank every member for their hard work. In addition to the activities report, we'll continue important legislation to strengthen our partnership with an important ally and trading partner, simultaneously creating jobs, reducing our dependence on Middle East oil, and reducing the price at the pump. H.R. 1938, the North American-made Energy Security Act, was introduced by Representatives Terry and Ross to expedite the presidential permit for the Keystone Pipeline extension. Expanding this pipeline will create the capacity to carry more than 1 million barrels of oil to U.S. refineries every day before the end of the decade. It will also create more than 100,000 jobs between construction of the pipeline itself and all of the economic activity that it will create. Canada's vast oil sands will be developed. The oil will be produced, shipped, refined, and used. The question is whether we, the United States, will partner with our northern neighbor and use this oil to help eliminate our dependence on oil from OPEC nations, or will we force Canada to find other customers like the Chinese who are hungry for energy supplies? This project has been delayed long enough. It is time to make a decision, and this bipartisan bill indeed will make that happen. So, again, I want to thank my colleagues for their hard work this year. Our nation faces urgent challenges. This committee can be a place where we find solutions. And I yield now to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today we're marking up one bill and a committee activity report. I'll save my remarks about the activity report for later and use this statement to discuss H.R. 1938, legislation that directs the President to expedite approval of the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. This pipeline would carry a sludge made from Canadian tar sands through the middle of America. It would raise gas prices, endanger water supplies, and increase carbon emissions, and it should not be approved. This bill overrides the executive order. Keystone XL is a highly controversial project. The State Department received nearly 50,000 comments on the draft environmental impact statement. Once it is built, we will live with the pipeline and its impacts for 50 years or more. This is a decision that we need to get right. Unfortunately, this bill's approach is not get it right. Instead, it says, whatever the risks and costs, just get it done. H.R. 1938 takes the extraordinary step of interfering in an ongoing decision-making process by the Secretary of State. The Secretary is in the midst of determining whether granting the permit requested by TransCanada would be in our national interest. The process for making these permit decisions was established by executive orders issued by President Johnson and President George W. Bush. This bill overrides the executive orders and other federal law, and it short-circuits the decision-making process. It requires the President to make a decision by November 1, even if the environmental impact statement has not been finalized as required under the National Environmental Policy Act. It cuts the time for other agencies to provide their views by 2/3. It reduces or eliminates the opportunity for public comment on the national interest determination. And it essentially determines the outcome. The bill finds that the earliest possible construction of Keystone XL will serve the national interest, making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the State Department to decide otherwise. I don't think Keystone XL is in the national interest. My greatest concern is that Keystone makes us more reliant on the dirtiest source of fuel currently available. On a life cycle basis, tar sands emit far more carbon pollution than conventional oil, almost 40% more by some estimates. That's because it takes huge amounts of energy to take something the consistency of tar, which they mine, and turn it into synthetic oil. We should be reducing our oil dependency using cleaner fuels, but Keystone is a big step in the opposite direction. This project raises many other concerns. At a subcommittee hearing last week on pipeline safety, we learned about the potential risks associated with tar sands pipelines. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration testified that current pipeline regulations may not be sufficient. TransCanada, Keystone XL's owner and operator, has had 12 spills on the first Keystone pipeline, and it has been operating for less than a year. Keystone 1 even had to be shut down earlier this month when it was found that continued operation without corrective action would be hazardous. The risks from spills are exacerbated with Keystone XL because it is routed through the Ogallala Aquifer, which spans 8 states and provides drinking water for 2 million people. The shallow water table and highly porous soils mean that a spill can spread rapidly. And with all these risks, the benefits are unclear. The study commissioned by DOE found that we will have excess pipeline capacity from Canada for the next decade or more, even without Keystone XL. And Keystone XL will likely raise, not lower, gas prices. In its permit application, TransCanada told the Canadian government that by addressing the oversupply of crude and raising prices, Keystone XL will increase revenue for Canadian producers by $2 to $4 billion a year. If it raises revenues for them, it's coming from our American consumers. I understand why Big Oil wants Keystone XL, and I know why they want to short-circuit the process. The more we learn about this project, the worse it looks. What I don't know is why we should be weighing in on the side of the oil companies when the risks are so high for the American people.
Chair would recognize the chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, Mr. Whitfield, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Upton, and we're delighted that H.R. 1938 is before the full committee. It's becoming quite clear that there is a pattern that's occurring at EPA, and that happens to be delay, delay, delay. Yesterday, we passed a bill on the House floor that would require EPA to change the way it does business relating to clean air permits for exploratory wells, exploratory drilling. The same type of delay is occurring in this pipeline case. TransCanada, the developer of this project, first submitted its application for a presidential permit in September 2008. The State Department didn't release its draft environmental impact statement until April 2010. And at one point in there, Secretary of Clinton even made the comment that she was inclined to approve it. Now, after the State Department issued its draft environmental impact statement, EPA rejected the draft statement and told the State Department they need to perform more work. After another year, the State Department issued a supplemental draft statement that addressed EPA's concerns. Even after that had been completed, EPA notified that that was not satisfactory and additional work needed to be done. So we see a clear pattern developing at EPA on a broad spectrum of permit requests. And the pattern is delay, particularly on projects that they have an adverse view of. The great thing about this legislation is we're certainly not directing any agency to decide one way or the other. We're simply saying it's about time a decision be made, and it has to be made by day certain. And one of the problems that we're having at EPA also is that final decisions are not being made, so there's no final administrative decision, and there's no way that you can go to a court system to get something resolved. So all this legislation will do is set a deadline for making a decision, and I hope that the entire committee will support H.R. 1938.
Other members wishing to make an opening statement on the Democrat? The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshu. And again, we welcome you back from your surgery.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all the members. Today we're marking up H.R. 1938. This legislation directs the President to expedite approval of the proposed Keystone XL pipeline, which would carry a sludge made from Canadian tar sands through 6 states, Montana, North Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, into the heart of America. The bill would require a final decision on this controversial pipeline by November 1st, unnecessarily, in my view, expediting a process the Obama administration said they would finish by the end of 2011. This project should not be rushed. The State Department received nearly 50,000 comments on the draft environmental impact statement. And once it is built, we will live with the pipeline and its impacts for generations. The tar sand oil that would be carried by this pipeline is very destructive because this oil emits far more carbon pollution than conventional oil, almost 40% more by some estimates. The carbon footprint is massive because it takes huge amounts of energy to turn a tar-like substance into synthetic oil. At a time when we must find ways to end our independence on fossil fuels, deepening our reliance on the dirtiest form of oil on the planet is simply not in the national interest. And this project will not solve our nation's energy needs. This bill and the Keystone XL pipeline would benefit oil companies at the expense of the American people, the public interest, and for all of these reasons, I would urge my colleagues to vote against it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I'm going to yield back. The Chair would recognize the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Barton, for a minute.
How much? Can I have 2? Is it possible?
Unanimous consent.
I'd ask unanimous consent for 1 additional minute for a total of 2.
Hearing no objection, gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the committee for granting me some extra time. I listened to my good friends from California, Mrs. Eshu and Mr. Waxman, in their opening statements. It strikes me as somewhat odd. We've had a pipeline application pending for almost 3 years on this particular pipeline. And the bill before us, as Congresswoman Eshoo just pointed out, says you've got to make a decision to accept it or deny it by November of this year. So that, we're basically saying in 3 years you ought to be able to make a decision on whether to grant the permit to build a state-of-the-art pipeline to bring about 700,000 barrels per day of crude oil from Canada into the United States. The reason that it's a positive for the United States to bring this crude oil in is that the refineries that it would come to were set up to process the heavy crudes from Mexico and Venezuela, and for various reasons those sources are drying up. We don't receive as much crude as we did in the past. The Canadian crude will fit the refinery equipment very well, and it will add to the available fuel supply for the United States. That should not be that controversial, and the bill before us doesn't say you have to grant the permit. It just said make it a presidential decision to expedite it and either say yes or say no by November. To the extent we have technical issues, those can be worked out by the technical experts, but surely members on both sides of the aisle can accept the fact that it's in the best interest of the United States to get additional crude supplies from North America into the United States. So I support the bill, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Chair would recognize other members wishing to make an opening statement on the Democratic side. Mr. Ross, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for bringing the committee together today to consider this important legislation. And I'm proud to help introduce H.R. 1938, the North American Made Energy Security Act, which directs the President to issue a final order granting or denying a permit for the Keystone XL pipeline project with November 1, 2011. Now, let me emphasize, all this legislation does is direct the President to make a decision. This has been going on for 3 years. Perhaps it'll go on for another 3 years, maybe 30 years. And all this says, it doesn't say approve it. It says make a decision, either granting or denying a permit. And I think it's important that everyone understands that point, because there has been some comments made this morning already that says it requires the President to approve it, and that's just not true. I'm very involved in this for a lot of reasons. I've got a lot of working families in my district struggling to get by. They're on a roller coaster with gas prices. They keep going up and up and up, and they simply cannot afford it. It especially hits those hard in rural areas, and I think the fact the President released oil this morning from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is another example of why we need this. Folks, we're sending $500 billion a year overseas to buy energy. Too much of that money is ending up in the hands of the terrorists that want to destroy us. It's time to start producing our own energy here at home, not only in the areas of oil and natural gas, but also in investing in alternative and renewable forms of energy so that we can get a lot of these promising ideas from the science lab to the marketplace. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me run over.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members, Mr. Shimkus is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take personal privilege, and I've been a member of the committee for 15 years, and for 8 of those, a Tracy has been behind my back. Ryan is here. His wife, Mo Tracy, used to be Mo Zilli, also served in my office for 8 years, and they are leaving my service. They're leaving the Services Committee, and they're leaving Washington, D.C. to go home, hopefully raise a family, and I just want to thank them. I want to thank Ryan for his service, and I want to thank Mo for her service. They're going back to God's country, and I want to take this opportunity to do that.
Michigan?
No, God's country, Central Illinois, where the living is simple, comfortable, and sweet. So if you would help me give them a round of applause, I'd do that. And I yield back my time.
Other members on the Democratic side wishing to make an opening statement? Seeing none, Mr. Terry is recognized for a minute.
Thank you. The sad part about this bill is that it's even necessary to do this. All other cross-border pipelines have received presidential permits between 18 and 24 months. We sit here at 33 months, 998 days with no end in sight with the complexities, the acts of the EPA in trying to change rules as they go along. There's been an environmental study done. There's been a supplemental environmental study done. PHMSA has made their requests, 57 of them, which have been adopted. So it's not like this hasn't gone through the process. But what is also disturbing and equally disturbing is how hard the left is fighting the jobs that are going to be created. According to the building and construction trades, which I have a letter here that I'd like to submit for the record, along with the LIUNA letter, which is other unions, 20,000 direct jobs from a project labor agreement, which these are all good, high-paying union jobs. So let's walk the walk on creating jobs.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks time on the minority side? Mr. Green of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the markup. And I want to start by saying my strong support for H.R. 1938, the North American Made Energy Security Act, which was introduced by our colleague, Congressman Terry. TransCanada has agreed to comply with 57 additional special conditions developed by PHMSA for the Keystone XL project. To supplement environmental impact, went so far as to state that the incorporation of these conditions will result in a project that would have a degree of safety over any other typically constructed domestic oil pipeline system under current code, and a degree of safety along the entire length of the pipeline similar to that which is required in the high consequence areas. Additionally, an independent study found that the $7 billion Keystone project is expected to create more than 20,000 high-wage manufacturing and construction jobs across the U.S., 118,000 person-years of employment. So not only would this project help our energy security, but it would also help our recovering economy by creating thousands of good-paying jobs. I'm constantly hearing from my building trades about their support for this pipeline and this bill, and yet none of this even matters because the bill very fairly doesn't say that the administration's determination should be. Instead, it just expedites a decision once the final environmental review has been complete. The pipeline application process to date already has substantially exceeded the duration of the two most recent similar cross-border presidential permit applications, and I encourage my colleagues to support the bill. In a personal note, the pipeline would actually end in the eastern part of our district. We had a scoping hearing in our district a year ago at the request of the Sierra Club, but it's still supported so we can have an access to that crude oil from someplace other than Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. I yield back my time.
That was a Texas minute. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for bringing this bill to full committee for markup. The North American Made Energy Security Act will break bureaucratic red tape and force a decision on the Keystone Pipeline. That is a decision that is long overdue. The bill will increase oil supply of 1.3 million barrels per day in the United States, which you know will have a positive impact on gas prices in this country at the pump. And let's talk about the economy. And those 20,000 jobs that will be created are high-paying construction jobs. And so 3 years of review is long enough. Let's find out, let's pass this, and let's find out if indeed the administration is serious about creating jobs. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks time on the minority side? Seeing no members seeking recognition, who seeks time on the majority? Mr. Sullivan of Oklahoma is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's almost ridiculous that we're even talking about something like this. In the United States, we're purchasing over $1 billion every day in foreign oil. And we're concerned about something like this. And we talk about jobs in America, too. Like my colleague Lee Terry said, this will create 20,000 jobs. I think it will create even more than that in the United States of America. And with unemployment the way it is and the economy the way it is, why aren't we doing something like this? This is absolutely ridiculous. It's about time that Congress wakes up and smells the coffee that lessening our dependence on foreign oil is a good deal. If you're not for this, you're for more OPEC oil. What is your plan? I hope the President's serious about this, and I hope this measure passes through the House, the Senate, and is signed by the President of the United States. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any members on either side that seek recognition for a 1-minute opening statement? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for scheduling this markup today. The bill before us would simply require the President to approve or disapprove the Keystone XL pipeline project within a defined time frame. When completed, the Keystone XL pipeline will transport nearly 1.3 million barrels of North American oil from Canada across the United States and eventually end up in the district I represent in the energy capital of the world, Houston, Texas. The benefits of Keystone aren't limited to Southeast Texas. Our entire nation benefits. In addition to helping shore up our nation's energy security, the Keystone XL will provide over 20,000 construction and manufacturing jobs at a time that our nation continues to struggle creating jobs. The administration wouldn't have to take 30 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to offset the oil we're purchasing from the Middle East. This project is a win-win, putting America back to work and strengthening American energy security with a trusted neighbor in Canada. I strongly support this bill that ends unnecessary delays and ask the President for a decision in a timely manner on the Keystone XL pipeline. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of the legislation that would move the Keystone Pipeline forward. If you look at just the recent announcement by the administration today that they would go and raid another 30 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that's not an answer to our country's energy needs. It's basically saying, well, you know, you've got known reserves here with both in America and with our friends in Canada, and instead of actually going exploring for energy that we know is right here, they're going to go and raid the rainy day fund with no plan to actually bring down imports. If you look at the Keystone Pipeline, you're talking about virtually eliminating Middle Eastern oil just with the reserves that they have there, not to mention the 20,000 jobs that you'll create. For every dollar we trade with Canada, we get back about 90 cents of that dollar. And yet the Middle Eastern oil that we could displace, when we send money to the Middle East, we get less than 50 cents of that money back. And much of that money goes and stays in countries that want to use that money to do harm against us. So if you look at high gas prices, the fact that the gas prices nearly doubled under President Obama, it's no surprise when they won't allow us to bring Canadian oil into America, where you create 20,000 American jobs and you eliminate our dependence on Middle Eastern oil. This is a no-brainer. We need to pass this legislation, create the jobs, and bring down the price at the pump.
Other members wishing to speak? Mr. Gonzalez from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I'll use this 1 minute, and we can have this discussion some other time, I guess, but it's appropriate right now. I will vote for this bill because I think it's important when it comes to the dependence that we have on foreign sources. I'd rather be looking to Canada. I'd rather be looking to Mexico. As much as I appreciate the Saudis, we may have some issues there, but I surely don't want to look to Hugo Chavez or Angola or Nigeria. But I don't want anyone to truly believe that the price of a gallon of gasoline is truly going to be impacted. And I've said this before. Morabin Odom, president of Shell, testifying before the Senate, said, simply stated, oil is a global commodity and oil companies are price takers, not price makers. Until we figure out what's going on with the speculators, don't think for a second that we're really going to impact the price of gasoline. And I've had this discussion with the American Petroleum Institute, and they give you one argument, but to be very honest with you, I think they would agree that we can't promise our constituents that it's going to be reducing the price of a gallon of gas, but we can surely tell them that it lends to our national security, and that's reason enough at this point. It doesn't mean that we're going to abandon renewable alternatives to what we have in fossil fuels. But we better figure out what are our immediate and needs in the very near future. And that's why I would be voting for this bill. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Chair would recognize Mr. McKinley from West Virginia for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my time here on this committee and also on the floor, I've heard many people say they don't waiting for a jobs bill, and for those that are uncertain as to what constitutes a jobs bill, this is a jobs bill. 20,000 construction workers, opportunities to put people to work in the refineries with this product when they bring it down to the coast and into Illinois. This is a jobs bill. Nearly 3 years after they've filed their application, to be waiting for this decision is unconscionable. It's time for this administration to either paint or get off the ladder, and let's put people to work. Thank you.
Not sure I've heard that before, but I'm going to remember it. Yeah, we know a different phrase that. Yeah. They have bears down there too? Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized. Cass.
I'm struck that unemployment in our nation is highest among men 18 to 24. As a side note, it's even higher among veterans who are in that age group. Now, as it turns out, these men, who may or may not have a college education, typically work in mining, manufacturing, or construction. Those are their options for good jobs with good benefits. Those people who are hostile to these sorts of initiatives are hostile to these men having good jobs with good benefits. As it turns out, there will be mining. There will be Americans, not just Canadians, helping with the mining. There will be construction that brings that down to the petrochemical plants. And at the petrochemical plants, many of the people who I represent work in these. Again, they have good jobs with good benefits, not government benefits, private sector benefits. So if my Democratic colleagues who oppose this bill really care about employment for these people who are particularly challenged now, I ask them to support this bill. I yield back. Thank you.
Someone yields back. Are there other members wishing to make an opening statement? Someone from Colorado, Mr. Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Boy, paint got a little carried away. I thank the chairman for the opportunity to speak this morning. Just wanted to talk a little bit about the report that was mentioned. If 20% of the price under Goldman Sachs is driven by speculation, then even under your own argument, 80% is driven by supply. So the fact that we could bring more supplies online through oil sands from our neighbors instead of the Middle East is an important approach that we ought to take. At 20%, as you're citing, driven by speculation, 80% then left for supply. We ought to be delivering more of our own resources in our own backyard into this country. Last night we passed a bill out of the House with bipartisan support to bring 1 million barrels of oil a day online. But yet today we see that the President has released the emergency reserve. The President says that he supports increased production on our outer continental shelf and other areas, yet takes actions to prevent it from happening. I think we've got to allow, work on H.R. 1938, the Keystone XL pipeline, make sure we have an up or down answer, a decision that can actually create jobs. And this report in front of us, the document in front of us says that the Alberta oil sands could present opportunities for as many as 6,000 jobs in Colorado over the next 4 years. I believe we ought to pass this bill and start producing our own resources here and resources from our neighbors and get away from our dependence on Middle East oil.
Other members wishing to make an opening statement. Gentleman from the great state of Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I want to express my appreciation to you for postponing the markup of the coal combustion waste bill. That's a bill in which I believe we can work the matter out and on which I wish to be helpful to the chair in this matter, as I know does my good friend Mr. Green from Texas. I would now focus my thoughts on the other piece of legislation, H.R. 1938. This directs the President to expedite consideration and approval of the construction and operation of the Keystone XL oil pipeline and for other purposes. The bill is unclear as to what he is to do under that instruction to expedite the approval of this particular pipeline. It also leaves us uncertain as to what changes in existing law, NEPA and other statutes, that will need to be done. We've had a bad experience with the folks at Keystone. You will recall, Mr. Chairman, that we had a magnificent spill in Michigan which screwed up our waters and our wildlife and our fish, and it made people very unhappy because, quite frankly, it gave strong evidence that the pipeline company was slovenly in the conducting of its business. It is also true, Mr. Chairman, that we had a major problem with regard to the proper enforcement of the law by the pipeline safety people in the federal government. They have a long history of poor work, as they do at the Department of Transportation. And this committee has had to be all over them like ugly on an ape to try and make them do the job that they are supposed to do. And I can recount the history of investigations that we have had over the years to try and make these people do what they should in terms of assuring that pipelines don't explode, don't leak into our waters, don't threaten the lives, health, and safety of our people. So we have here then, Mr. Chairman, a situation where what we are seeking to do is somewhat unclear. I'm anxious to work with you on this matter because I would like to see this pipeline built. I would also like to see it expedited, but I'd also like to know how and why it is going to be expedited and what statutes are going to have to be changed to meet our concerns about seeing to it the matter is expedited. I thank you for your courtesy to me, Mr. Chairman. I will have a few useful questions which I will direct at staff to try and have them help us understand what it is we are doing here and how it is we're going to benefit ourselves rather than put ourselves at risk by legislating sloppily to help somebody who has a bad history to function in the construction and operation of a pipeline carelessly and sloppily. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to make an opening statement? Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, today we are marking up the May Energy Security, North American Made Energy Security Act, or the Trans-Canada Act, which would short-circuit the permitting process and require the Secretary of Energy to coordinate all of the federal agencies in charge of issuing a final decision on the Keystone XL pipeline by what is agreed to as an arbitrary timeline. Mr. Chairman, only a week ago, in a hearing on pipeline safety in the Energy and Power Subcommittee, the nation's foremost experts on this subject testified that currently we do not have a comprehensive plan for transporting tar sands through the heart of our country. And we do not even know if this substance provides a greater risk than other types of crude oil. In fact, the administrator of the Pipeline Safety and Hazardous Materials Administration, PHMSA, as well as the executive director of the Pipeline Safety Trust, told the subcommittee directly that this issue has not even been studied at all. So today, we simply don't know how transporting this type of vitamin could affect pipeline safety or how a spill might impact our environment. Yet, instead of heeding the advice of the very experts responsible for overseeing the safety of our pipelines and examining this issue more carefully before moving forward, here we are marking up a bill directing the administration to hurry up and make a decision on the pipeline, regardless if the agencies responsible for studying this issue have completed their vital work or not. It appears the majority's view is let's move forward at full speed and we'll worry about safety after the fact. For my constituents who witnessed the same type of reckless behavior on the part of BP executives leading up to the Deep Horizon oil spill last spring, this bill is incomprehensible, irresponsible, ill-conceived, and indefensible. We simply do not have a plan, or some would say even a clue, and it would be reckless indeed for Congress to attempt to rush approval for this pipeline, as this bill clearly does, without first even studying the safety precautions associated with moving forward. And I urge all of my colleagues to support the amendment that I will offer, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to make an opening statement? Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm opposed to H.R. 1938. I believe we can meet our nation's energy demands without destroying our environment in the process, and unfortunately this bill fails to meet that standard. Forcing the President to rule on Transamerica's XL permit request before completing a thorough review is both short-sighted and hazardous. Transamerica's Keystone Pipeline has been in operation for less than a year, has already had 12 known oil leaks, and was called, quote, an imminent threat to life, property, and the environment, unquote, by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration earlier this month. The XL pipeline, an extension of the Keystone Pipeline, would run through the Ogallala Aquifer, which provides 30% of our nation's irrigation water and drinking water for 2 million Americans. A spill contaminating the Ogallala would be an irreversible tragedy. The Keystone XL pipeline is clearly not a project the President should approve without careful consideration. I cannot support this legislation and yield back.
Other members wishing to make an opening statement? Seeing none. The chair calls up H.R. 1938 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1938, to direct the President to expedite the consideration and approval of construction and operation of the Keystone XL oil pipeline and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, if there are not, are there any other amendments to the bill? Gentleman from California. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has an amendment at the desk.
Number 3.
Number 3. The clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 1938 offered by Mr. Waxman.
And without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with by unanimous consent, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
When the Subcommittee on Energy and Power met to mark up this bill, Subcommittee Chairman Whitfield portrayed it as the answer to high gas prices. He said that, quote, more oil means lower prices, end quote. That sounds logical, but oil markets are just not that simple. The Keystone XL pipeline is projected to actually increase gas prices in the Midwest. The owner and operator of the pipeline, TransCanada, told the Canadian government that this project will increase oil prices in the Midwest because of markets conditions specific to Midwest refineries. Therefore, TransCanada said the project will increase annual revenue to Canadian oil producers by an estimated $2 to $3.9 billion in 2013. And at the hearing last month on the bill, no one disputed this. Now, I know that my Republican colleagues will say that higher crude prices won't necessarily increase gas prices, but at least one prominent oil market economist doesn't agree with them. Philip Verliger, who served in both the Carter and Ford administrations, says that Midwestern farmers and consumers will pay billions more at the pump if Keystone XL is built. And when Mr. Rush asked the TransCanada representative at the hearing whether he could assure American families in the Midwest that their gas prices wouldn't go up with Keystone XL, he couldn't do that. Nor will building the Keystone XL pipeline lower gas prices for the rest of America. The simple fact is that oil is a global commodity, and absent unique regional market conditions, prices are generally set by the world market. The amount of oil transported by Keystone XL is minuscule compared to world oil consumption, and the Keystone XL pipeline will do nothing to change world oil prices. According to the Energy Information Agency, the EIA, the United States is producing the most oil it has produced in 20 years. So are gas prices lower today than they were 20 years ago? The answer is no. 20 years ago, the average price for a gallon of regular gas was $1.11, according to the EIA. How much did you pay for gas this week? So my amendment is very simple. It adds a finding that states what TransCanada told the Canadian government about oil prices in the Midwest. I offered this amendment during the subcommittee markup. It was rejected. I opposed the bill, but even those members that support the pipeline shouldn't try to sell it to the American people as lowering gas prices when, if anything, it will raise them. I urge my colleagues to be honest and straightforward with the American public. Vote for this amendment, which simply recognizes the oil industry's best projection of how this pipeline will affect oil prices. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman yields back. Or the
In opposition to the amendment?
Nebraska is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I think we do need to be honest and straightforward with the American public. What this will do is bring 700,000 barrels per day from a trusted neighbor in Alberta, Canada. Yes, it's a heavy crude. Heavy crude is a discount, and it will sell on a world oil market price. It is 2 points here. We had that hearing. We had a trans-Canadian representative here and a whole panel. And my impression from their testimony was that they all, I thought, very clearly, except for the trans-Canadian that wouldn't answer the question directly because, as I interpreted, he wasn't going to dictate or counter a fellow employee, but it was pretty clear that he wasn't going to agree with that person either. But we had economists and industry people here that said the same thing that Gene Green said. Oil is going to be set by the market price. That's what the refineries in Texas and Illinois and Oklahoma will pay for it. So to sit here and say that this will be an increase is a prediction of world oil prices, which I would disagree that putting more oil onto the market would actually lessen world oil prices. It would add to supply. It's about equivalent to, well, about half of what Libya is producing or not producing now. So it makes sense to me that if you're putting more oil onto the market, that prices will decrease, and that's exactly what the testimony will be. But I've got to just vent a little bit here. It seems so odd to me that the left fights so hard to bring in this Canadian oil. Yes, it's a heavier crude. But yet we have no statements about the money we're sending Venezuela, a communist, well, yeah, once freely elected, but now I'd say a political dictator that's using our oil money to buy military equipment from Russia, and we have no concern with that. So to me, by bringing in this 700,000 barrels per day and the oil security that will be achieved for the United States here, the money that we won't send to OPEC, that we won't send to Venezuela, certainly is important in this process. But to sit here and say that prices are going to increase because of this pipeline is just nonsensical. I have a minute left. Does anybody want a minute here? I yield to the gentlelady, Kathleen McMorris-Rogers from Washington.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. I was just going to piggyback on your comments related to Venezuela, you know, because I am in full support of this North American, Made in North American Energy Act, and I want to see us getting our oil from friendly neighbors and working together with them, and it makes sense to me. It makes a lot more sense than importing 1 million barrels a day from Venezuela, sending them $27 billion annually. Almost a third of their GDP in Venezuela is coming from America. And I just wanted to reinforce that point and offer my support of this legislation.
Thank you. Yield back. I'm sorry, I'll yield to the gentleman.
Yeah, and I'll just take the last 44 seconds and, you know, highlight the jobs created. I know this is kind of directed to the Midwest. Remember, there's 2 pipelines. There's the Keystone and the Keystone XL. The XL is to take this heavy crude to Texas. The Keystone goes right to my district. $4 billion of investment to receive this heavy crude. Thousands of construction jobs over this period of time. And I would just raise the question as, if more crude doesn't affect prices, why would the President release oil from the SPRO? And I would say that he is making the case more crude will help stabilize or lower prices, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Other members in support of the amendment, gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Mr. Chairman, I just simply want to point out that all this amendment does is reference the report that had to be filed with the Canadian government that Keystone, they found themselves that access would strengthen Canadian crude oil pricing, which would, quote, expected to increase the price of heavy crude to the equivalent cost of imported crude. So, in fact, the cost of the oil is going to go up. And that was the finding they made that they filed with the government. Now, I yield to Mr. Dingell if he'd like the rest of my time.
I thank the distinguished gentlewoman. Mr. Chairman, I have some questions I'd like to ask the staff here. I have been looking with some diligence to find what the President is instructed to do to expedite the consideration. I find that to be in the at the bottom of page 5, line 23 and following. Am I correct on that? That's yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I look with some diligence to find what it is here that is going to expedite this, and are there any specific instructions to the President or any agency of the U.S. government to take any steps or actions which would, in effect, expedite the processing of the application of Keystone?
Well, yes, because
I mean,
the reference to
if there are, please point them to me so that I... where are they?
Page 6.
Page 6? All right, what are they?
Page 6, line 2 and 3. The requirements are that the agency is responsible for making the President's...
If I read that correctly, it says the agency responsible for coordinator considering an aspect of the President's national interest determination, the President's permit decision,
and those are
construction and operation of the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, what statute here is being amended? What is the President being instructed to do? What is any cabinet officer or regulatory agency being instructed to do here?
The requirements for the presidential permit decision and national interest determination are embedded in Executive Order 13337, and in that
where is that mentioned here?
The The executive order is not, but the president has been executing his authority under.
We are told here that this is going to expedite the processing, and I'm asking what steps is the pipeline company going to be instructed to do? What will the Pipeline Safety Agency, Department of Transportation, or any of them be instructed to do? I find nothing.
The process for the presidential permit decision is made pursuant to Executive Order 13337, and it sets out the agencies that the Secretary of State.
That's not mentioned here, is it?
The presidential permit is, and the president executes that under
all right, let's
Executive Order 13337.
For 15 minutes, my name is Obama, and I'm sitting in the Oval Office, and this thing comes into me, and I'm going to say, what did my dear friend Mr. Upton and my friends at Ways and Means, or rather at the Energy and Commerce Committee, instruct me to do? And he's probably going to say, or rather I'm probably going to say, well, I'm a bald-headed liar if I know, because I find nothing here that tells me what it is I'm to do to expedite this. It's some fine language, and it sounds good, and I'm sure it'll look good in campaign brochures, but the curse of it is, I don't find anything that is mandated to the president or to any cabinet officer or federal regulatory agency to take any steps here to move the process forward faster than they would do under existing law.
In general, it is the case that the president has been issuing these presidential permits since the 60s under an implied authority for foreign affairs and as commander-in-chief, and then to actually execute that implied authority, he's been conducting it under an executive order, the most recent of them being issued April 30th, 2004.
With all respect, young lady, you're a fine lawyer. I got to say, you can make a very, very good pleading on behalf of a very, very bad case, and I do salute you for that. I will observe, however, that I find myself, as I leave office here, no longer being named Obama, still confused as to what it is I'm supposed to do about this thing, and I really am not in a position to say how any of this is going to expedite my decision-making process or any decision-making process inside the administration. And I've been praying that you would tell me, but I'm 27 seconds over, and I guess we just have to wait for another time. Thank you, ma'am.
Gentlemen, young lady's time has expired. The chair would recognize Mr. Barton for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I would certainly prefer a Barack Dingle in the Oval Office to Barack Obama. I think watching Mr. Dingle be president would be quite the treat. I also enjoy watching Dingle be Dingle in committee. He said almost nothing, but he said it in such an enjoyable way that it was entertaining. The key phrases there are the president shall expedite, and on page 6, take all necessary actions necessary. So there is specific language in the bill to meet the gentleman from Michigan's objections, but sometimes it's fun just to watch Chairman Dingle be Chairman Dingle, and I enjoyed that. On the pending amendment, very briefly.
Ben, you have been most gracious and kind to me this morning. Thank you.
You are a true treasure of the entire Congress, not just this committee. The amendment before us is somewhat odd in that it's an amendment to the findings, first of all. I guess I could offer an amendment if I were on the minority side. I'm in a grumpy mood, I don't like the bill, and I'm against it. And put that in the findings section if our counsel would have said that was germane. What Mr. Waxman is attempting to do is take something out of the permit application which was really talking about enhanced revenues for the Canadian producers and put it in the findings. If you go back and look at the application, which our excellent majority staff has done, this part of the application that Mr. Waxman is referring to was simply pointing out the fact that because of limited marketing opportunities, because of delivery options, the Canadian oil that results from the tar sands sells at a discount on the world market to to Saudi Light right now of approximately $20 a barrel. But if you give an additional outlet for markets, which the pipeline would do, there is a distinct possibility that that discount would shrink because there would be more competition for that particular product. In this case, oil that's derived from the Canadian oil sands. So it, but that does not mean that the price that consumers would pay, in the Gulf Coast at the end of the pipeline would rise. It would give consumers an additional option. They could take oil from the pipeline. They could take West Texas Intermediate coming over from the Permian Basin. They could take imported oil from Mexico and Venezuela, or they could continue to even import oil perhaps as far away as from Saudi Arabia. It would be an additional source of supply, and that is not going to raise prices. Mr. Waxman was absolutely correct when he pointed out that oil is fungible and that it is a world commodity, and on average, there is an average price that's set every day in the marketplace. Different people try to manipulate it. OPEC tries to tighten supply and raise the price. Various producers, and as has been pointed out by Mr. Shimkus, the President of the United States is trying to influence the price as his election prospects dim by releasing 30 million barrels of oil, hopefully to lower prices during the peak driving season this summer. So various factors every day in the world market try to influence the average price, but each specific type of crude oil sells at a premium or at a discount to the world price. And the Keystone Pipeline, if it's approved and if it's built, is going to provide 700,000 barrels of oil today to the chief area of the United States that has our refinery complexes, and that additional supply will provide competition for the existing supplies, and that should, all things being equal, if the world oil situation is in balance, tend to lower prices to the consumers in the United States that are in the market areas served by the refineries. I'd be happy to yield.
You've given us a very erudite explanation of markets, but TransCanada submitted a claim that they're going to get $2 to $4 billion increase in revenues. And under your argument, no one's paying that. It's obviously $2 to $4 billion that somebody's going to pay, and it's going to be the people in the Midwest because of the unique conditions of the supply of oil in that region.
Well, reclaiming my 2 seconds, the Canadians are saying if they have an increased outlet, that $20 a barrel discount might decline because there's another outlet for the oil. But it still has to compete on the Gulf Coast with other sources of supply. And if it doesn't compete economically, it will not be taken. So overall, as we put more oil into the American market, you're going to tend to drive the average price down. And with that, I oppose the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markup, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is just to, reinforce the point that Mr. Waxman was just making, and that is that in a document provided by Keystone to the Canadian government, so this is an official document from the company to the Canadian government, it says that it will actually increase revenues for tar sands producers by $2 to $4 billion a year by raising crude oil prices in the Midwest. So, we just have to basically take them at their word that that's what the impact will be of, the approval of this project. And maybe the majority doesn't want to acknowledge the business model that TransCanada has for this pipeline, but it does intend to make additional billions of dollars off of Midwestern families and Midwestern farmers.
Will the gentleman yield?
Let me just finish here for a second. And by saying that it will reduce gasoline prices over and over again just doesn't make it so, because that's not what this pipeline project, according to their own documents, is intended to achieve. So if the permit application is inaccurate, then Keystone, TransCanada should correct it. But the fact is that there is no need for the pipeline right now. A report commissioned by the Department of Energy states that for the next decade, there is excess pipeline capacity even without the Keystone XL. This pipeline is being touted as a way to help Americans at the pump. Instead, like so many other Republican bills, it is just helping the oil industry at the expense of the American public. I would be glad to yield to my friend from Texas.
Well, thank you. In an earlier life, you sold ice cream at Fenway Park. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
On a day, and there never was such a day, but assume there was a day that there was only one fan at Fenway Park, did that decrease your revenue potential or did it increase your revenue potential for your ice cream sales?
That would be a rainy day. That would be a rain out.
So you probably decreased, but on the day when there were standing room only and it was hot, you tended to increase your revenue potential. Is that not correct?
You definitely want thirsty children begging their parents to buy ice cream at Fenway Park. That definitely enhances your...
You know markets because you probably were the premier ice cream seller at Fenway Park. If you were in charge of marketing for the Canadian oil sands, you would want more potential customers rather than less, and you would want a delivery system that got it to them sooner rather than later. And that's all this study, that the permit application that you're referring to is saying, is that it gives them an additional outlet, and by giving them an additional outlet, they can sell more oil than they would otherwise. And number two, by creating more competition for it, they might get a higher price. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I would say in response that you are correct, but the price was...
Let the record show Mr. Markey finally admitted that, that I was correct about something.
Here's what, I can reclaim my time. Here's the way it works.
Yeah,
okay?
it's your time.
When I was selling in a blue-collar community, a popsicle cost 7 cents. When I moved to an affluent community, I raised the price of a popsicle to 10 cents. I'm driving around in my ice cream truck. I'm 18, I'm 19, I'm 20, I'm 21.
I didn't know you had your own truck.
Oh, yeah, it was my
I'm
own
impressed.
truck. And it was a huge truck, and you're going out the window. But when I went over to Fenway Park at night, I raised my prices to 25 cents. Now, since the popsicle only cost a penny at 9 a.m. in the morning at the warehouse, and I'm out retail, it's true that I did raise my prices. And the hotter the night is the higher the price. And by the way, you could get it because there was no competition. There were no corner stores. Mr. Frosty wasn't there with his truck, and I was all alone. So what I learned about markets, in fact, was that you're kind of looking to control the market and to charge whatever you can get away with in that market. And what we're learning here from this filing by Keystone, by TransCanada, is that they intend on taking $2 to $3 billion, $2 to $4 billion a year by raising crude oil prices in the Midwest. And I do understand that because I had a temptation to do that when I was 18, 19, or 20, because I understand the insight, that you have to have into markets if there really is no control over what a producer or a sales operative can extract from consumers. And here, it just doesn't seem as though it makes a lot of sense from a market perspective for the U.S. at this time. I yield back to Balance Mike.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to speak in opposition to the amendment. Canada is Ohio's largest trading partner when we're looking at foreign countries, and if we didn't have Canada up there, we'd be in trouble in the state of Ohio. And we need Canadian oil, and as has been said from my colleagues, that it's very, very important that we trade with our friends and also send our money to our friends. We don't want to keep sending money to people that don't like us, and we don't know where that money then ends up. But when we know that it goes up to Canada, it gets used by them, and we get about a 90% return on what we send up there. And as we're talking about needing more oil, I'm not sure how many people when they go home on the weekends, because I'm home every weekend and I put a lot of miles in my car across the district, have noticed some things going on. When when I go up to the gas pump and buy my gas, I'm noticing people are buying 3, 4, or 5 gallons at a time now. They're not out filling up those tanks. So we have a lot of folks out there that are, really living paycheck to paycheck, and they've got to have more oil, and we got to have it at a better price. And one of the things also that we need to have in the Midwest are more jobs. And one of the kind of interesting in one of these reports that's right before us here, showing that an increase in jobs by the impact of Alberta oil sands development on U.S. state economies from 09 to 25 shows that in Ohio alone that we'll have an increase from 2011 to 2015 of about 13,200 jobs, an increase in jobs from 09 to 25 of 23,500. Also shows up in Michigan that there'll be an increase of over 18,900 jobs. And again, we're close proximity to our Canadian friends. And when I used to be in the Ohio legislature, I was closer to Windsor, Ontario than I was to Columbus, Ohio. And so we have a lot of trading going back and forth up and down I-75 with our Canadian friends. Also, I'd like to point out that just the number of firms is, by this report showing that how much more jobs we can create out of this because of the number of suppliers from the state of Ohio that supply manufacturing products up into Alberta and into the Canadians. It's 39 suppliers. Michigan is 21. Pennsylvania is 67. These are all jobs that we have to have in the states. We need them in Ohio. We need them in Michigan. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Are the other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, I think we're ready to vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will vote aye. Those opposed say no. No. Those appear to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Other members wishing to offer an amendment to the bill. Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, number 9.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts.
And the gentleman, the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will circulate the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. During our hearing on this bill, we were repeatedly told that approving this pipeline would lower gas prices at the pump, despite the fact that TransCanada's initial assessment projected that oil prices would rise in the Midwest as a result of the construction of the Keystone pipeline. TransCanada also projected that its profits would dramatically increase because it could charge for more for oil on the Gulf Coast than it can in the Midwest. We were also repeatedly told that the oil coming from Canada would enable us to reduce our dependence on oil imported from unfriendly Middle Eastern nations. In fact, TransCanada's application for its permit even states that the proposed pipeline will serve the national interests of the United States by providing a secure and reliable source of Canadian crude oil to meet the growing demand by refineries and markets in the United States. And despite 12 spills from the existing Keystone pipeline in the past year, we were repeatedly told that cutting short the environmental safety review of the Keystone pipeline would be fine because of all the benefits that will accrue to the American people from lower gas prices, increased jobs and greater energy security once this pipeline is approved. But we were not repeatedly assured that once all of this oil is shipped from the tar sands of Canada all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, that at the end of the day, none of it will be simply placed on oil tankers and be re-exported to be sold within the larger global oil market. My amendment simply ensures that all of the purported benefits from the approval of the Keystone pipeline go to the American consumer and not to big oil by requiring the Department of Energy to ensure that the oil stays here in the United States and the benefits refiners and the consumers in the United States and not in countries around the world. It does this through a requirement that the Department of Energy ensure that the oil and refined petroleum products that will be transported by this new pipeline enter domestic commerce for final disposition. The President may waive this requirement if he finds that such a waiver is in the national interest, which in my language means that 3 conditions must be met. First, before waiving the requirement that oil stay in this country, the President must find that a waiver would not lead to an increase in imports of crude oil or refined petroleum products from countries hostile to the United States or with political or economic instability that compromises supply security. Second, the President will also be required to determine that a waiver will not lead to higher costs for oil refiners. And finally, and most importantly, the President will be required to determine that a waiver will not lead to higher prices at the pump for the American consumer. This amendment is consistent with the longstanding U.S. policy on oil exports. There are already similar provisions in place to restrict oil exports from the Trans-Alaska pipeline and other domestically produced oil that is transported by way of pipelines across the public lands. This amendment continues to allow for oil swaps between the United States and other countries in which equivalent amounts of crude oil and refined product moves between the U.S. and friendly foreign nations, and continues to preserve other bilateral agreements and existing authorities. At our hearing, one of the witnesses asked the question, do they want secure, stable oil from a friendly neighboring Canada, or do they want to continue importing even more high-priced foreign oil from volatile regions such as Venezuela or the Middle East? We should not pass legislation that expedites the approval of such a complex and controversial project without at least making sure that the secure, stable oil from friendly neighboring Canada stays here in the United States to protect our consumers, our economy, our people from being tipped upside down at the pumps by actions that are taken by other countries around the world. I urge an aye vote on this amendment. I yield back to balance.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas first. Recognize.
And I don't think I'll take 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman. It pains me that my friend from Massachusetts, who started off with such promise as an ice cream seller and understood markets so perfectly that he was even capable of manipulating the market by deciding where best maximize his profits, and I didn't even know he had a mobile supply outlet, i.e. an ice cream truck that he could move around. To see how far he has fallen as he has gotten wise and seniority in Congress. Either you trust markets or you don't. Now, I will stipulate that probably 95% of the time, every bit of oil that comes through this pipeline, if it's built, that's refined into products, is going to be sold in the United States simply because we're the largest market. We tend to have the best prices, and it just makes economic sense. However, having said that, there will be occasion. A hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, something happened in perhaps in one of the Caribbean islands, in Mexico, that it makes economic sense to produce product that is produced to be shipped overseas. I don't think that'll happen very often, but it on occasion may happen. If you trust markets, the market will determine the best way to maximize the profit from the products that are refined. Just like Mr. Markey maximized his popsicle profits by he knew he could get the best price at Fenway Park where he had a monopoly, but during the day when there were no games, he would go out into the neighborhoods and sell popsicles for less, but he still made a profit because it only cost him a penny. And knowing the golden heart of Mr. Markey, while he won't admit it, I bet there were occasions where he went into the poor neighborhoods of Boston and gave popsicles away because he's just that kind of a guy.
Mr. Chairman, does the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield.
Well, first of all, I did not know our colleague from Massachusetts sold ice cream at Fenway Park. I was proud of my time. I sold Cokes. Here in the South, we call it soda water. Colt 45s.
Yeah, I probably bought some. You probably ripped me off.
Before we had the Astros, we had our Colt 45s. But I just wanted to engage you because I'm familiar with imported oil. I have two refineries I have five refineries actually, but two of them have contracts. One with Mexico. The Shell refinery has a contract with Pemex to bring in heavier Mexican crude. And part of that agreement is they have to ship back refined product to Mexico because Mexico does not refine enough in their own country. But that's part of the contract. Now, I have a Lyondale refinery that for years has brought in heavier crude from Venezuela. Now, there's no agreement to send back to Venezuela refined product. Citgo probably takes care of that. But you know, this would be the first time we would put that on a requirement because we do import oil from other countries, and part of that agreement is to send back refined products. So why would we do this? But
the agreement that you just alluded to is a market-based approach. They send the product where it makes the most sense at that time to send them. And I will stipulate that for this particular product, a market-based approach will always be best. Will always be best. We don't need the Markey Amendment, as well-intentioned as it is, because it will distort the market. And with all due respect, the President of the United States is not the best person to decide market outcomes, regardless of who's in the White House, whether it's President Dingell or President Obama or maybe my governor, you know, President Perry, or my former speaker, President Gingrich, whoever. They're not in the best position to determine how to allocate output. So I would respectfully oppose Mr. Markey's amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak in support of the amendment, Mr. Waxman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I support the Markey Amendment. We hear over and over that the State Department must approve the Keystone XL pipeline to enhance our energy security. As one of the witnesses at the hearing pointed out, shipping Canadian oil across America doesn't make it a domestic product. And if that Canadian oil is then exported to China, we'll have gained nothing, absolutely nothing from this pipeline except for the higher gas prices in the Midwest, more profits for oil, Gulf oil, coast oil refineries, and the risk of oil spills in the Ogallala aquifer. Well, that's a pretty bad deal. And in fact, the finding in the legislation, finding number 7, says the principal choice for Canadian oil exporters is between moving increasing crude oil volumes to the United States or Asia, led by China. Increased Canadian oil exports to China will result in increased United States crude oil imports from other foreign sources, especially the Mideast. Well, that would be a bad deal. But the Republican response to these concerns is this won't happen. The oil companies won't send the tar sands crude oil or refined products to China or other countries. Maybe not, or maybe not right now. There is a market, and maybe if the market conditions are right, we'd better not count on the oil companies not to export. Does anyone here really think that out of the goodness of their hearts, the oil companies will forego profits if they can get a better price for their oil elsewhere? After all, the CEO of Valero, which is pushing for Keystone XL, says that, quote, the future of refining in the U.S. is in exports. The future of refining in the U.S. is in exports. Now, we hear from people representing those areas where there's going to be increased refining, and their oil companies' constituents are going to make a lot of money. But that doesn't mean the oil is going to stay here. Patriotism sure hasn't stopped many manufacturers from relocating overseas. All we have to do is pick up the newspaper any day of the week and hear about all the profits for which no taxes are paid in the United States because the companies go through these extravagant ways of trying to make sure they didn't make the money here for tax purposes. And they would claim they're patriots for sure. This amendment simply provides that if the State Department approves Keystone XL to enhance energy security, we should have some assurance that the oil will be used here rather than being shipped to China. The amendment doesn't bar exports. Instead, it provides reasonable leeway for the President to allow for exports when it is in the national interest. I think that's the minimum we should ask, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I want to yield to Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentleman very much. In the amendment itself, we make it possible for the President to provide waivers for such requirements if the crude oil is refined in an adjacent foreign country and consumed therein in exchange for the same quantity of crude oil being consumed in the United States. So that helps to provide for some constancy in terms of the international agreements that are reached, but it keeps an equivalent amount of oil here in the United States for our consumers. And it also gives the President the ability to issue a waiver if there is an international agreement that has to be met as well. So I think that it's important to understand that ultimately we should only do this if it's helping our country. You know, we should do it in order to protect our consumers. For every $10 a barrel that the price of oil goes up, it's 0.2 of a point off of the GDP growth in our country. And one of the key factors since World War II has been that 11 out of 13 recessions that have occurred since World War II have been related to increase in the price of oil. One of the best ways to ensure that that does not occur here is to make sure that any oil that we have stays here and is used in order to reduce the likelihood of an increase in economic activity being harmed.
We know, Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, that the Canadian oil companies, Canadian crude oil companies, are going to make an extra $2 to $4 billion at the expense of the Midwestern ratepayers. We also know that the oil company refineries are going to make money when this crude oil is brought down into Louisiana. What we don't know is whether the Koch brothers are going to make money, because they wouldn't even answer our questions, nor did we get any cooperation to get answers to our questions. But presumably they may make some money out of all of this as well. But we are not going to get the benefit for the American people because they make more money at the refineries and at the oil companies and in Canada.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is almost comical. Yes, if we buy more oil from OPEC, Venezuela, they're going to make more money from it. That's how markets work. I would encourage my colleagues to vote no on this. Not only is it requiring now several new hurdles to jump through that aren't already in statute. This is a way of trying to kill the pipeline here. In reality, which is the ultimate goal here, is to kill the pipeline because they don't want this new oil coming in, because it's all about being against fossil fuels. That's been confirmed by some of the environmentalist comments in the Politico article today. But
will the gentleman yield?
I want to in just a second. But not only is this impossible, it's impossible for the President to even make those determinations and guarantees unless the President has total control of the markets. Now, Chavez has done that in Venezuela, but I'm not sure the American people is willing to give the President total control of the markets in the United States so that he would become a dictator that could manipulate the markets and make those type of dictates. But here's the practical problem here, and that, or answer, is that if we send this oil to the refineries, they are going to use that because it's a heck of a lot cheaper, easier, accessible than bringing it in on the ships. But here's just one little statistic. Alberta to Houston to Shanghai, 11,500 miles. Alberta to Vancouver to Shanghai, 5,900 miles. I yield to the gentleman from Kentucky.
Well, thanks very much for yielding. You know, listening to this debate and reminds me of the article in the New York Times recently where a spokesman for the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is the leading critic of this pipeline, made the comment, this is really a campaign against tar sands expansion rather than this particular pipeline. And I think that's exactly the case here. But if we are going to be less dependent, it's important that we take product from wherever we can. And I think the gentleman made a great point that it will be going to China if it does not go here. And I would yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you. I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I thank the gentleman from Nebraska. A couple other points to add to this. We currently have a large amount of foreign aid to OPEC countries. And any of my colleagues have traveled to these countries and see how beautiful their roads are, their new buildings, they're building islands with our money to the tune of $129 billion a year. We don't get much say in that because we also know the OPEC countries meet and they have talked in the past about raising oil prices to the cost of $200 a barrel. We're not at that table because we are dependent upon them. And also world oil prices are affected by how much oil is in the market. Now, we may not be able to control where all that oil is sold. Will some of it go to foreign nations? Maybe. I know that that is part of what happens. But when oil comes from Canada and through the United States, that's things that OPEC cannot control. And when OPEC cannot control it, we have leverage against some of those oil prices. And we have leverage against it. They don't have their hands around our throat, squeezing more out of us and then building beautiful things in their country. That's the way the world markets work. And that's why I believe we should be doing all we can to make sure that we have more of this oil coming through the United States. One other point about this, too, is there's also a large amount of gasoline we import because we don't have the capacity to do several things. I say use more of our oil, drill more for our oil, use more North American oil, and help bring prices down under our control. I yield back to the gentleman.
Reclaiming my time, I just want to read from the EPA's own letter of July 16th, page 3. Quote, based on our review, there is a reasonably close causal relationship between issuing a cross-border permit for the Keystone XL project and increased extraction of oil sands crude in Canada intended to supply that pipeline. Not only will this pipeline transport large volume of oil sands crude for at least 50 years from a known dedicated source in Canada to refineries in the Gulf Coast, there are no significant current export markets for this crude oil other than the United States.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? See one more, and then we'll... Gentleman from Louisiana.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if the author, maybe I just don't understand the amendment, but I'm not sure that the author of the amendment understands what they do with oil. Now, only a portion of the oil goes to gasoline. There are different fractions, some of which is used for jet fuel, some of which ultimately serves as feedstock for the production of plastic.
The gentleman using his mic?
It's on. So some of it is used as feedstock for plastics. Now, as it turns out, ExxonMobil is in my district, and I know the left hates ExxonMobil, but they recently did an expansion in my district. 9,000 people were employed constructing the expansion. Now, another, I don't know, a few thousand are going to be employed producing the plastics that are exported across the world. Now, that is an export from a fraction of the oil. When I asked the folks there why did they choose to expand in Louisiana as opposed to China, India, or elsewhere, they said, one, we have rule of law. That's good. Two, we have great workers. That's also good. And three, they said they have reliable feedstock. Now, it is the reliable feedstock, which is a portion of this oil, a refined petroleum product, that our workers are actually turning into something that we export across the world. Now, I don't think the author of this bill understands that it's not the whole It's not the whole thing that goes into gasoline. It's only a fraction. And that other fraction employs thousands of American workers making products that we then export, high value added products. Now, do I think that the president would understand this? Absolutely not. The president has shown minimal understanding of oil and gas markets.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I thank you. Yes, on line 7 of my amendment, it says very clearly that if the oil is entered into domestic commerce, then it is fine. And domestic commerce.
No, but what if it's
domestic
across
commerce?
the world?
Domestic commerce. I will say this: that it's that would include the industry that the gentleman was just.
We're reclaiming my time. If they make a high value added product and then they ship it to you name it where, because
that would be fine. That would be fine under my amendment.
I don't
say
see
that
where
for the congressional record, for congressional intent. That would be fine.
Will gentlemen yield?
Yes.
You know, as a fellow Exxon, I have a Exxon refinery in my district as well, and I can tell you the number of jobs it provides. Refining oil from Canada, frankly, is incredible, and you know the folks that work there appreciate that every day. I think this amendment, you know, when we say no, it's intended to. No, the whole intention of this amendment is to kill this pipeline. We know that. I mean, that's what all of these amendments are intended to do, is to kill this pipeline. And so, you know, when we talk about where we are in an energy crisis, we talk about where we are in a jobs crisis, these are the basic things that we should be doing to help our economy recover and to get unaddicted to foreign oil. And it's one of the most impossible things we can do to even get a pipeline. And I'll yield back to the gentleman.
That's just the point we're making. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are the other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I just want to point out that the bill expedites the approval of this pipeline without the usual process for reviewing it. Many of us want that review to take place. That doesn't mean we don't want the pipeline to go into effect if it meets all the standards. So on one side, you say, no, standards, we don't need standards, let's waive them all. On our side, let's review them, and some of us may think we shouldn't have the pipeline at all, but let's not attribute these motives to us. That
will the gentleman
you ought to
yield?
Recognize there are motives on your side as well.
Will the gentleman yield?
Be happy to.
The intent of the bill is to come to a decision. The decision could be no pipeline. So this bill says
the way the bill is drafted.
It says make a decision. It's already been delayed. So to say that one side or the other, we're not saying make a yes decision. We're saying make a decision.
Reclaiming my time. There has to be a decision made, whether it's in our national interest. The finding in the bill says it is in our national interest. That's one issue that doesn't have to be resolved anymore. Without any further review, we've decided it legislatively.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to, but I only asked for 1 minute. It's up to the chairman to decide when that minute's up. But as long as I have time, I'll yield to you.
Why don't we continue the discussion in the next amendment and vote on this one?
Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. See no other member wishing to speak on the amendment.
For 1 minute, if I may just be recognized for 1 minute, and I need no more than 1 minute, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized. Ask unanimous consent for 1 minute.
I thank you. The gentleman from Louisiana, the gentleman from Illinois, they seem to raise concerns about whether or not this oil can be used in the domestic plastics industry based down in the Gulf states, and the answer is no. There's no restriction upon that. If the product that's then created is sent into the global marketplace using this oil, then there's no problem with that. The issue would be if the oil was then put in tankers and sent to other countries and then used by other countries for their purposes. That's what we're objecting to. If we're going to allow for all of these environmental and other issues to be compromised, then the beneficiary should be the American plastics industry. The beneficiary should be American consumers. That's all I'm saying with this amendment.
Mr. Chairman.
And so I understand what the intent is, and it is to help the American plastics industry to have this stream of oil coming to help them. That's really the goal, and I urge and I vote on the Markey amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I think we're ready to vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. No's appear to have it. The gentleman asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will read the...
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, nay. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bilbray, nay. Mr. Bass. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, nay. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush.
Aye.
Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshu.
Aye.
Ms. Eshu, aye. Mr. Engel.
30 more seconds.
Mr. Engel, aye.
Thanks a
Mr.
lot.
Green.
No.
Mr. Green, nay. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, nay. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Upton.
I was waiting. Votes no.
Mr. Upton, nay.
Other members wishing to vote. Mr. Bass.
Mr. Bass, nay.
Mr. Sullivan. Ms.
Mr.
Bono-Mack.
Sullivan, nay. Ms. Bono-Mack, nay.
Mr. Rush. Excuse me, Mr. Towns. Mr. Towns. Towns votes aye.
Mr. Towns, aye.
Rush has voted. Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that there were 17 ayes, 27 nays.
17 ayes, 27 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman?
Let me go to Mr. Dingle first. Mr. Dingle, do you have an amendment at the desk?
I'll wait my turn, but I'll be happy to be recognized.
All right.
I yield to Mr. Dingle.
Mr. Dingle.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the clerk's desk at page 6 after line 16.
The clerk will read the title of the amendment. The clerk...
An amendment offered by Mr. Dingle of Michigan.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. This is a very simple amendment. It says, no action by the Secretary of Energy pursuant to this section shall affect any duty or any responsibility to comply with any requirement to conduct environmental review. One of the things that has been troublesome as we have gone through this business of permitting drilling, pipeline construction, and other things has been that we have done a poor job of reviewing the environmental impacts of that action. If you look back at the recent events in the Gulf, you will find that there was a hideous mess. Some 5 billion barrels of oil were deposited in the Gulf, caused no end of difficulties because a lot of the environmental requirements were disregarded as matters went forward down there, and as a result, the people of the whole Gulf area found themselves thoroughly abused by that result. Keystone, if those of you will remember, has been active in running pipelines in Michigan. They did it in such a slovenly fashion that we had a very fine mess up there near the district of the chairman and near the district of Mr. Rogers and a number of others of us who have had to live with the consequences of the incompetence of Keystone and the fact that the permitting was done poorly by the state. This amendment simply says that although the matters of issuing of the permit will be expedited, they will not allow for there to be slovenly handling of the environmental reviews that would be necessary under the National Environmental Policy Act or any of the other statutes, including the Pipeline Safety Act, which relate to how the permitting of the pipeline or the drilling or other acts would be considered. In my discussion with the staff, you will recall that the staff indicated that there was nothing in here which would impair the different environmental laws that relate to pipelines, and drilling and other issues of this kind. So just to sort of keep everybody on their toes down there at Department of Transportation and the other federal regulatory agencies that would address the permitting that we have here before us, out of a surcease of caution, I offer this amendment which simply says that the requirements to conduct environmental review and the duty therefore will not be adversely affected by the legislation which we have before us. It is quite possible that the legislation, that is redundant, but having dealt with pipeline spills and the consequences of it and some of the other spills that we have seen associated with these matters, I feel that the greatest care in assuring that proper review of these matters is taken. So I would urge my colleagues to vote for the amendment. It is not going to slow anything down. It will simply encourage the people who are doing the reviews to do the reviews as they would and as they should and as will best assure the safety of all persons concerned.
Will the gentleman yield?
Which means so much. Yes, I'll yield to the gentleman.
I want to speak in support of your amendment. It ensures that this legislation does not interfere with the National Environmental Policy Act or other required environmental reviews. This is an amendment is important because it makes clear that if the State Department needs additional time to comply with NEPA, then they will not be bound by the November 1 deadline in the Act. This is just common sense. The State Department has received more than 230,000 public comments on the supplemental environmental impact statement for this project. It's highly controversial. It only makes sense for them to take the time they need to comply with the law. Well, and I urge support for this amendment.
I thank the gentleman for his support. I would note way back when I was a young fellow in this place and had hair, I was the author of the National Environmental Policy Act. It's worked well to see to it we know what we're doing. It has not slowed down things, but it has made sure that we have been safe, correct, wise, and proper in what we have done. I yield back the balance of the time.
Gentleman yields back his time. I yield myself 5 minutes. I just want to say the gentleman from the great state of Michigan has had a very convincing argument. We see no reason not to accept this amendment as part of the bill, H.R. 1938, and we recognize its positive impact, and we'll accept it. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Yeah, will gentleman yield? I agree with your decision, Mr. Chairman. I think making sure that there's clarity in here that the environmental process and Department of Energy will continue as it's supposed to. I'd like to point out that these are not my prepared notes here sitting in front of me. This is the environmental impact study, the supplemental impact, environmental impact study. The EPA has, in its first one, made 57 recommendations that PIMSA adopted. The gentleman's correct. He should hear me. So there are 57 recommendations were already adopted. Another set of recommendations from the supplemental are in the process of being adopted, and hearings set on those. So nothing in this bill, as we wrote it, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Emeritus, were ever intended to interfere with the occurring process. So yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I yield back my time. All those in favor of the amendment will signal by saying aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Other amendments to the bill, Mr. Rush from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 37.
Clerk will read the title of the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will circulate the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I really think that we can just deal with this amendment. If you just, I will rename this amendment the Dingle Unblock Amendments if you want to just move it through the committee with that caveat, and we'll save a lot of time. Mr. Chairman, during the Energy and Power Subcommittee markup, I offered my amendment to delete a finding that I thought was particularly misleading. Finding number 15 states, analysis using the Environmental Protection Agency models shows that the Keystone XL pipeline will result in no significant change in total United States or global greenhouse gas emissions, end of quote. My amendment was defeated on a party line vote after my colleagues on the other side insisted that the statement was indeed true. Well, Mr. Chairman, this past week I wrote a letter to EPA asking the agency to weigh in on the accuracy of this finding, and this was the agency's reply. I again quote, EPA has conducted no modeling nor provided any models to analyze the likely effect of the Keystone XL pipeline on U.S. or global greenhouse gas emissions. The language in the above finding is therefore incorrect, end of quote. The official EPA statement went on to say, again, as detailed in the supplemental draft environmental impact statement for the Keystone XL project issued by the Department of State, the Department of Energy directed a contractor to conduct modeling on potential impacts of the project. EPA provided some data to be used in that effort, but, and this is highlighted, EPA models were not used, and the EPA did not model any projected emissions effects of the project, end of quote. Mr. Chairman, there are some who believe that the majority does not care about the facts or truth or science if they can get in the way of the industry moving forward unfettered. So today, we have an opportunity to set the record straight and prove to the American people that when a statement is demonstrably shown to be false, then members of the Congress, Democrats or Republicans, will put their partisan differences aside and stand on the side of the truth. Scripture tells us, know ye the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So in order to correct this misleading statement contained in the bill, I urge all of my colleagues to support my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Yield back the time?
I yield back. I yield to the remainder of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I want to support your amendment to strike finding 15 in the legislation, which says that analysis using EPA models shows the Keystone XL pipeline will result in no significant change in total U.S. or global greenhouse gas emissions. This finding is just not supported by the facts. Nothing in the record for this decision shows any analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions based on an EPA model, nor does the record indicate that under no circumstances would the Keystone XL pipeline result in higher greenhouse gas emissions. Supporters of the bill point to a study done by the consulting firm ENSYS to claim that this finding is accurate, but this argument is a red herring. The ENSYS report does not use EPA models. It doesn't even claim to. Instead, it simply says that some of the data it used is consistent with some of the data the EPA has used in the past, and the report specifically says that it does not reflect the views of any government agency. Tar sands crude is more polluting than conventional oil, and the supplemental draft environmental impact statement recognizes that tar sands crude has substantially higher life cycle greenhouse gas emissions compared to the average U.S. crude supply. The supplemental data environmental impact statement also includes an analysis by DOE that shows that there will be an increased total gas emissions compared to the base case under at least one of the scenarios. So I would urge that we support the Rush Amendment and not to put a finding in legislation that is not based on, is not accurate and not based on correct information.
All right. Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. I think probably the best way to argue against this amendment is simply to read what's in the environmental impact statement. There has been a study done on life cycle greenhouse gases, and I encourage my colleagues on the supplemental environmental impact study, page 35. Now, technically correct that the EPA did not do the study. A study was done on behalf of the EPA. That study on page 35 says, quote, changes in life cycle greenhouse gas emissions were calculated with the models and methodology used in deriving indirect impacts of petroleum consumption for the RFS2 program. Petroleum Indirect Impact Analysis, February 2010. Here is a copy of the rules for doing the impact statement from the EPA. This is the EPA's standards that were followed in this greenhouse gas emissions. The conclusion, let me see if I can get to the right chart here, but on page 41, global life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is all part of the environmental record. The chart, global life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, no XL pipeline versus Keystone XL pipeline, concludes that there is negligible difference in the life cycle greenhouse gases. Now, this leads us to why the argument that we just heard in favor of the argument leads us to why we have to have a bill. because all of the standards and procedures in developing the environmental impact study that the State Department will rely on to determine if it's in our national interests to approve this pipeline are now being changed by the EPA. In their recent July letter, the old standard of doing it is this: EPA's own rules and regulations. But now the EPA in a letter suggests a different method. Well, they're just saying, well, that didn't work out for us in trying to delay this, so let's come up with something new. You can't compare heavy crude to heavy crude. Remember, we're displacing heavy crude with heavy crude from a friendly country, not Venezuela. And so they say what you have to do is compare it to Texas sweet crude. Now, come on, that's not the standard. The standard is right here. EPA, follow your own dang rules. We're on to your game. We understand you're against this pipeline, and you're doing everything you can to change the rules, just like you did in the Chickasaw Sea and everything else in regarding to fossil fuels. We understand your game. That's why we have this bill.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I'm bemused by the arguments, and I really think that my friend from Nebraska might make an argument for a number of other different issues that might surround this particular issue, and he certainly made some assertions about this pipeline that I don't share. But let's stick to the facts of this. This bill, it has some allegations. This bill has some assertions that are totally false. And that's really underlined by the statement, a letter from the Assistant Administrator, Ms. Gina McCarthy, dated June 22nd, where it says here that in the second paragraph, EPA provided some data to be used in the effort, but EPA models were not used, and EPA did not model any projected emissions effects of the project. Now that's real clear. You can say whatever you want. You can get a whole library of papers.
I'm just reading. I reclaim my time, Mr. I reclaim my time. I'm just reading these studies. I'm just reading the studies, not the EPA trying to kill this project for you. I'm just reading the studies.
Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? On the Democratic side? Any members? Mr. Gardner, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of this amendment, I just want to submit for the record an article that says oil sands project in Canada will go on if pipeline is blocked. The entire argument that we're hearing is about, oh, we can stop this, so we can strike this language and we'll prevent this from happening. Well, here's what it talks about. Environmentalists are using the project as a proxy for their general antagonism toward oil sands production, which consumes large amounts of water and energy. This is really a campaign against tar sands. This is a quote. This is really a campaign against tar sands expansion rather than a single pipeline, said Susan Casey Lefkowitz, the director of the international program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. It's going to continue, as the article says, by rail or ship or network of pipelines. It's going to happen. That is coming somewhere.
Will the gentleman
and yet we are sitting here talking about trying to
Will
delay.
the gentleman yield?
No, I will yield back my time.
Gentleman
Thank you.
Yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Yeah. Seeing Mr. Waxman.
I have not been recognized on this amendment, and I just think it's the right thing to yield to Mr. Rush, and I'd like to.
I really. It seems as though the other side is trying to make a record that this side is against the pipeline. I don't think that anyone over here has made that decision yet. The administration hasn't made that decision yet. And it seems as though when we are attempting to help bring some clarity to this bill, to help bring some truth into this bill, then we're accused of being opposed to the pipeline or trying to kill the pipeline. That's not true. I have some suspicions. I'm sure that most of us who represent Midwestern states, we're concerned about whether or not this is going to increase already skyrocketing gasoline prices in the Midwest region and in our district. Of course, we have some concerns about that. But we have not made a, I know I have not made a final determination. So I think that the other side is really trying to, again, bamboozle this process in using those kind of arguments. The fact remains that what we are doing is we're not standing for the truth in this legislation, in this committee. And I have been on this committee for many, many years. And I have never, ever, during Democratic reign or during Republican reign, I have never, ever been a part of a process where there was a blatant lie in a bill that came out of this committee, whether it was on the Republican side or the Democratic side, that we didn't try to correct. And both members, all members of this committee, know that this is an erroneous assertion that the EPA modeled and that the EPA conducted this study. You know it and I know it. No matter what you say, no matter how many papers you bring forth,
Would the gentleman
how many
yield?
studies, we all know that this is an untruth. It's a lie.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield. I'll be happy to yield to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Waxman. I'm feeling a little bit like I'm being called a liar here. The study was done, I did say for the EPA, I misspoke. It was done for the State Department. And the EPA then used, and the State Department used Brookhaven National Laboratory using Department of Energy's Global Energy Model. I'm just reading the report. So those are the facts that are before me, and that's
Well, if I might reclaim my time.
So I yield back.
Look, there's truth and there's fiction. The statement of the finding that Mr. Rush seeks to strike is that EPA did a report. EPA did not do a report. Some other company did a report, and it's not EPA's. So why not correct the finding? I've still got a couple time for myself here. If it's not accurate, don't say it. But it just seems we're seeing over and over again in this committee, truth doesn't make a lot of difference. We can state things as facts, even if they're not. We can deny that there's global warming and climate change, even if it's going on. We can say there's no impact on the climate around this country, even though every day in the news the first story is about a flood or a drought or something unexpected. We can put our heads in the sand and say, we're right, we're right, we're right, and everybody else is wrong. We know that everybody else wants to stop this pipeline. Well, the truth is that this pipeline without this bill is probably going to be approved because Secretary Clinton seems inclined to support it. The State Department, which has jurisdiction, seems inclined to be for it. I wish they would have more time to review the input from other agencies, but under existing law, they have the power to do it. Your bill is to try to ram that project through without letting the rules be observed because you're convinced it's right. Well, sometimes you're convinced things are right when you're wrong. It's true for us, too. But don't make a finding in law something that is not accurate. And I appreciate Mr. Rush pointing that out, and I don't know why you should be so exercised. If he points something out that's inaccurate, you should just say, oh, you're right, let's drop it out, and then go on with your bill and get the same result.
You can.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Illinois.
Speak in opposition to the amendment, but I'd like to yield the time to Mr. Terry for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, John. I do get exercised when there's a mischaracterization. So the finding says in the bill that this amendment's going to change the language. I'm reading the bill now. Analysis using the Environmental Protection Agency models shows that Keystone XL pipeline will result in no significant change in the United States are global greenhouse gas emissions. That is a fact. The greenhouse gases, according to the draft in supplemental environmental impact study, makes that conclusion. The EPA standards set forth and footnoted throughout the environmental study says that the EPA's modeling was used. So I think that's the facts, and I will yield back to John.
And just a reminder that the first Keystone pipeline has helped create thousands of jobs in my district because the refinery changed and expanded to process this heavy crude. So my district has already benefited from the first pipeline in jobs. That's why we have numerous letters. Here's one from the building trades, friends of mine, even though I'm Republican. We have a letter here from the International Brotherhood of Teamsters supporting this legislation, the Laborers International supporting this legislation, the International Union of Operating Engineers, also good friends of mine, supporting this legislation. The United Association of Journeymen and Apprentices of the Plumbing and Pipe Fitting Industry of the United States and Canada, supporting this legislation.
What we're saying.
They're supporting this legislation because it's going to create jobs. It's going to keep our workers employed in good, I will in a minute, in good, high-paying jobs. How do I know that? In this downturn of this economy, really in my colleague Jerry Costello's district, but right next to my district, we have undergone a $4 billion refinery expansion. $4 billion have been put at risk by corporate America to receive this heavy crude. In this expansion, thousands of workers of organized labor have been working for 2.5 years expanding this refinery. We had the biggest crane in the world in our district building this refinery.
Mr. Terry, would you yield since you have the time?
It's my time.
Oh, excuse me.
So this, and I'll yield, Mr. Waxman, but I'll just finish this point. This is, as we said in other amendments, this is a jobs bill. Why would we not move to create and preserve and expand American jobs? And with that, I would yield.
Thank you for yielding. Look, I could see your argument why you support the bill, but the amendment before us is to strike the finding that says analysis using the Environmental Protection Agency models shows that the Keystone XL pipeline will result in no significant change in total U.S. or global greenhouse gas emissions. That's a finding we're going to put into law. Yet we've got a letter from the EPA that says that EPA has conducted no modeling. I ask unanimous consent the letter be put into the record. EPA has conducted no modeling nor provided any models to analyze the likely effect of Keystone XL pipeline on U.S. or global greenhouse gas emissions. The language in the above, which is the finding, therefore is incorrect. So, look, the argument for the finding is, well, maybe it's not technically correct, but one could think it might be correct because the analysis was done the way EPA would have suggested we do it, but EPA says they never suggested it. It would not harm what you're trying to accomplish
And
to adopt the Russia amendment.
just so I can reclaim my time for the last 5 seconds,
Yes.
reclaiming my last 5 seconds, the finding says analysis using the Environmental Protection Agency models. We're not asserting that the EPA, we're saying that the models were used, and that's why the statement of finding is correct. My time
EPA
expired.
says it's not true.
Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. Noes appear to
Well,
have it.
Mr. Chairman.
gentleman asked for a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, nay. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, nay. Mrs. Bono Mack. Mrs. Bono Mack, nay. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, nay. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, nay. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, nay. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, nay. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, nay. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, nay. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, nay. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, nay. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, nay. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, nay. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Towns. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Rush.
Rush votes aye.
Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshu.
Aye.
Ms. Eshu, aye. Mr. Engel.
Aye.
Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green.
No.
Mr. Green, nay. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle.
Yes.
Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross.
No.
Mr. Ross, nay. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, nay. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Upton.
Votes no.
Mr. Upton, nay.
Other members wishing to vote, Mr. Stearns?
Mr. Stearns, nay.
Mr. Bass?
Mr. Bass, nay.
Mr. Gardner?
Mr. Gardner, Mr. Gardner's already recorded.
Okay.
Gentlemen's no.
He's okay. Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Oh, is there one down here? Mr. Doyle? Oh.
He's recorded.
He's lifting his finger up. All right. Clerk will report the tally.
Quit.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 16 ayes, 26 nays.
16 ayes, 26 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other members wishing to ask?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rush.
Offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Rush had already asked me. Sorry.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, number 36.
An amendment offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
The amendment will be considered as read. The clerk will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to say this. During the last Congress, I co-founded and chaired a Jobs Now caucus, and I represent a district that is in dire need of jobs, and I am looking forward to a time when my district can enjoy even more jobs, and so I am pro-jobs in this Congress as I have been in most Congress. But my amendment will allow for 120 days after final environmental impact, or no later than January 1, 2012, for the President to issue a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline. Mr. Chairman, a week ago in a hearing on pipeline safety in the Energy and Power Subcommittee, we heard testimony from the nation's foremost authorities warning us that we simply do not know the environmental impact of transporting diluted vitamin through the heart of the country, or how this substance differs from other types of crude. And yet, this bill would force the administration to issue the presidential permit for the pipeline within 30 days of the final environmental impact study and no later than November 11, 2011, November 1st, 2011. This arbitrary timeline will reduce the allocated time that federal agencies should have to determine the national interest in deciding this proposal by almost 2/3, while also reducing or eliminating the 30-day public comment period. I believe public input is a vital and a necessary part of the determination process, especially for the local communities that will be most affected by a decision to move forward. I also believe that it is important for the various departments to weigh in with their national interest determinations, which this bill will severely curtail, if not completely eliminate. In fact, in conversations that my office has held with the State Department as well as the EPA, we were informed that it would be close to impossible for the responsible agencies to do their due diligence and reply to the arbitrary timeline of November 1st as this bill would mandate. Additionally, the State Department has already publicly stated that it expects to have a decision on Keystone out by the end of the year. Mr. Chairman, my amendment will allow for the appropriate time period for the public and the different agencies to weigh in, while also mandating that a decision is made within a timely manner. Pushing the deadline back by just a mere 2 months will avoid short-circuiting the review process and also make sure that a decision is made in a reasonable time period. So I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I seek time in opposition. Just a couple of points here. First, I want to clarify that what this bill does is says a decision needs to be made. It doesn't say yes or no. It just says that here's the timeline. Now, it doesn't, Bobby.
You're good, man. You're good. You're good.
It doesn't. It says make a decision. It doesn't say yes. The other part of this that I'd say is maybe you've had conversations with the State Department, but we asked them to come up here and provide us testimony, and they refused. So I don't have any evidence that they need any more than the 5 months that they have to follow up on the EPA's recommendation. They're setting hearings. If they come here and say they can't do that in 5 months, we'd probably be open to changing their date. But we have no evidence that they can't do their hearings that they want to do a second round of can't be done in 5 months. So without any evidence saying they can't do it, I just don't see any reason to agree with this. I yield back to the chairman.
Well, I would just like to comment that EPA had a 60-day comment period for its proposed regulation of utility MACT, which had a financial cost to this economy of over $14 billion, estimated to increase electricity costs by 8 or 9%, and they had a 60-day comment period. So if they can complete a gigantic 1,000-page regulation with a 60-day comment period, you would think that they would be able to do this within 5 months.
What the gentleman here, Mr. Chairman?
It's my time, and I'll they seem to have enough time to be able to do this, as you just pointed out. And keep in mind, this is the second round of doing this. This isn't the first time of going out for public comment. There's already been 2 others in the time. The other part, before I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, is I'm kind of offended that the State Department won't talk to us, but you get to call them up and they give you information. I'm kind of offended at that right now, and I'll yield to you.
Well, I think we might clarify this. I called the EPA, the State Department. They answered the phone. You called them and told them to get up here within a matter of a few hours, and they said that they could not make it during that time period that you gave them to get up to be here to appear before the committee. So I'm sure they would answer your phone call and give you the same information that they shared with me. If you would just call them, dial first and call them, and they will answer the phone and give you the same information.
Well, reclaiming my time on that, I respect the gentleman's comment there. We gave them 2 weeks. We've also made comments to them. We'd like to hear from you, and they haven't. So it's been difficult.
If you would yield just for a second, I don't recall that invitation going to the State Department with a 2-week period that they were supposed to respond.
Yep.
I don't recall that. What I do recall is the fact that they were asked to be here within a totally unreasonable amount period of time, and they couldn't make it. They said they couldn't make it, and they also stated that if you would give them an appropriate timeline, they would try to be here.
Reclaiming my time. Not to keep dickering on little points here that are sidetracking us, but we invited. They declined. They didn't say that there was a scheduling conflict. They said they would not come. There's a difference between not being able to come and refusing to come. And the hearing was noticed a week in advance, and the invitation made the week before that. I'm going to yield back to the chairman of the subcommittee if he has anything to add to this, but otherwise...
Mr. Chairman, if you will yield a minute to me.
Well, do you want to yield to Mr. Rice?
I'll yield my remaining 14 seconds to the gentleman, my friend from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, also the EPA indicated that they didn't want to appear before the committee because they were in the middle of determination. They were deliberating on this particular project. And I might add, 60 days. We're asking for 60 days. And I think that is not something that's unreasonable. We want an additional 60 days so that they can have the time to go through perform their due diligence, so that they will be able to reach a decision and that is in the best interest of the American people. And I don't think jobs are going to be adversely affected in 60 days. We're all for jobs. Let the jobs come if they're going to come. But give this the agency, give the affected agency, give the public, the ones who are going to be most affected by this. We're not talking about plumbing in a building or a home. We're talking about a pipeline with thousands and thousands of miles. There should be due diligence.
Gentleman's time's expired. Does anyone seek recognition? Vote. Question now occurs on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it. Are there further amendments? The gentlelady, Ms. Christensen. For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
What's the number at the top?
5005.
An amendment offered by Ms. Christensen of the Virgin Islands.
May be recognized.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that we must reduce our reliance on oil from high conflict resolutions, but H.R. 1938 attempts this at a very high cost. And it makes a series of findings, as has been discussed, related to the Keystone XL pipeline. Some of these findings are a matter of opinion, and some are just flat out wrong. But all of these findings share one characteristic. They all support the pipeline, and inconvenient facts are not included. In fact, there are a lot of inconvenient facts about this pipeline, as we've heard, that the American people should know. This project has many potentially significant adverse environmental impacts. Tar sands require far more energy to extract and process than the conventional crude oil. The result is that the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from using tar sands fuel are estimated to be from 9 to 37% higher than from our baseline fuel mix. Overall, fuel from tar sands pipelines could erase roughly 2/3 or more of the greenhouse gas emission reductions that the President's vehicle standards would achieve in 2020. This pipeline will almost double our current use of tar sands fuel at a time when we're trying to curb carbon emissions and stop global warming. Keystone XL makes us more reliant on one of the dirtiest sources of fuels currently available. And the jobs it said it would create would be better off being created from expanding renewable and clean sources of energy. This amendment adds a finding. It adds a finding that simply recognizes that Keystone XL will increase carbon emissions and make it harder to address global warming. The finding states that the State Department's supplemental draft environmental impact statement estimates that the Keystone XL pipeline would increase carbon pollution associated with U.S. fuel use by up to 23 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, which is equivalent to the annual emissions from an extra 4.5 million passenger vehicles. It's important, as has been said, that we are truthful with the American people about the true cost of the Keystone XL pipeline. It would have devastating effects on the environment, and we need to be upfront with the American people about those effects. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back balance for time. Does anyone seek Gentleman, Mr. Terry, recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to the gentlelady's that a substantial amendment that's substantially similar to one we debated just a little bit ago. And I'll reiterate from the record that the EPA has been provided, State Department requested, modeled after EPA, or using the EPA modeling, that it concludes that global life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, comparing the pipeline to no pipeline, is negligible. We've established that. That's the record. And I would like to read from the supplemental as well, saying, despite the differences in study, design, and input, it is clear that Western Canada crude oils would likely be transported through the proposed project are on average somewhat more greenhouse intensive, although the study shows that there would be no substantive change in global greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the construction of the proposed project, and no substantive change in Western Canada WCSB crude oil imports into the United States, whether the project is implemented or not. So I'm going to yield to the gentlelady, because I don't know where in the record it shows that there'll be an increase, and I would appreciate if you could give me the reference. I'm referencing the study that's in the record right now, saying that it's negligible. So I yield to the gentlelady.
And I don't have the report right with me, but
all right, reclaiming my time. I'll go ahead and yield back my time. We've debated this.
A gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Is there further discussion on this amendment? Gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I support the Christensen Amendment. On May 12, 2011, the National Academy of Sciences, our nation's preeminent scientific organization, released a new report entitled America's Climate Choices. And the Academy charged the writing of a consensus report to provide authoritative analysis to inform and guide our response to climate change. And they found, quote, climate change is occurring, is very likely caused primarily by human activities, and poses significant risk to humans and to the environment, end quote. The Academy called delaying action imprudent and urged that the U.S. should begin ramping down emissions as soon as possible. Similarly, the Vatican has recently weighed in on climate change. On May 11, 2011, a report by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences emphasized the dangers associated with climate change. This legislation takes us in exactly the wrong direction. Rather than listening to the experts and cutting carbon pollution, this legislation says full steam ahead for pollution control. The Christensen Amendment simply recognizes the facts, and if we approve this pipeline, our carbon pollution will increase. Let's not deny reality. Let's approve the Christensen Amendment.
Gentleman yield.
I'd be happy to yield. Gentleman from Washington.
I just am looking forward to the day where we start getting together on this issue, not just about this pipeline, but this larger issue, whether we got a problem. And I just am going to ask my colleagues across the aisle, I'm going to send you all a report that was issued 2 days ago by a consortium of marine scientists. And this is probably the most esteemed marine science conclave people have ever had. And they issued a report 2 days ago that basically said we are heading for major extinction events in the oceans because of a combination of ocean acidification caused by carbon dioxide, temperature changes, and pollution. And the thing that was stunning about it is they basically said, we're not looking at little tiny changes in the oceans. We are looking at mass extinction events that have never happened in human history and will be equal to the previous 6 extinction events the planet has had. This amendment's not going to solve that problem, but I am going to send my Republican colleagues this report, and I hope that you'll just take a look at it, because this isn't a global warming issue, it's a global collapse issue of major life forms in the ocean upon which we get about 16 or 20% of our protein. And I just hope you'll take a look at it, because I hope the day will come when we can get together and figure out how we're going to skin this cat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Inslee. The question will now occur on the amendment. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, noes have it. Are there further amendments to the bill? Are there any further amendments to the legislation?
Yes.
The gentlelady from California, Ms. Eschew, is recognized for 5 minutes for explanation of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Let me just have the clerk report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Ms. Eschew of California.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent that as the copy of the amendment is being passed out to members, that a September 11th, 2010 article from the San Francisco Chronicle accompany the amendment as well.
Is she offering that?
Objection. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Public pipeline safety is not a subject I take lightly. On September 10th, 2010, there was a natural gas explosion in San Bruno, California. As a result of that, 8 people were killed, dozens were injured, and there was the destruction of 55 homes. To put this into geographic context, San Bruno, California is very close to San Francisco International Airport in San Mateo County, the county that I live in. While San Bruno is not in my congressional district, it is in Congresswoman Spears. This is one of the most shocking events that has taken place in the Bay Area, in Northern California, and in our country. We've been regulating natural gas pipelines, and I would urge you you may not have time to read the article, but when you see this picture, you can understand the devastation. We've been regulating natural gas pipelines since 1968, and we're still seeing horrific explosions like the one in San Bruno, California. I think it's dangerous to move forward with a tar sands oil pipeline, which we have little to no experience regulating, before we have the proper safety knowledge and procedures in place. And that's what my amendment is about. We're hearing strong concerns that pipelines carrying tar sands and the chemical bitumen may pose greater safety risks, I may not be pronouncing that correctly, than pipelines carrying conventional or synthetic crude. At a June 16, 2011 hearing on pipeline safety held by the Subcommittee on Energy and Power, Cynthia Quarterman, who's the administrator of the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, PHMSA, testified that her agency, which is specifically designed for researching and administering pipeline safety, had not done a study analyzing the risks associated with transporting diluted bitumen, but would be happy to do such a study if required by Congress. So my amendment would require PHMSA to complete a comprehensive review of the properties and characteristics of this and the hazardous liquid pipeline regulations before the final presidential permit is issued on the Keystone tar sands pipeline. This study, I think, is important for the safety of all Americans and will determine whether current regulations are sufficient to regulate pipelines used for the transportation of tar sands crude oil. I think that this approach makes sense because it's far less costly to build pipelines correctly than to try to fix or replace a line that's already built. And I think that the San Bruno explosion speaks to that. So, Mr. Chairman and members, I think we all realize that we have a profound responsibility to protect lives. Certainly we have to take into consideration money and property and take the proper precautions now. So for these reasons, I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and I'll reserve the balance of my time if I have any. Yeah, I do.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. I just want to say to the gentlelady that this next month in July, we're intending to start moving the pipeline safety bill, which, as you know, expires in September. And I intend to have a conversation with Chairman Micah later today, as our two committees have joint jurisdiction, and he has the Transportation Committee actually has a little bit, certainly a big say in terms of jurisdiction on this bill itself, and we're working out details between the two. But I want to say I do support a study on this, and as you know, the pipeline safety bill, because it expires in end of September, we need to deal with that in both the House and the Senate, and that study. I would support a study as part of the pipeline safety bill, which we will deal again with in subcommittee next month. I've just seen the amendment, so I'm not as certain as to where I would be as it relates to the finding that's here. But I wonder if the gentlelady might withdraw her amendment now. We'll absolutely commit to working as a study for sure, maybe beyond that, in the couple weeks that we have before it would go to markup in subcommittee next month. No, I'd rather do that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for what you've said, and I have really respect for what you've said. I think that that your intentions are absolutely sincere. I'm worried, and I do want to work with both you and Chairman Mica, because this is what's coming up in the relative to the pipeline bill is an essential moment for us to visit the issues that I just outlined in this amendment. But having said that, I don't think we should go forward with this unless we have something that speaks to the pipeline issue, because this is really, it's dangerous.
Well,
this is something I think that needs to be included. So I have a dilemma.
Yeah, well, I want to ensure that, if and again, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, has indicated that she's inclined to move forward on this bill, or on the Keystone XL pipeline. She said that nearly a year ago. We want to make sure that all of our pipelines are safe, and no matter what it carries, natural gas, whatever, in that, and it is appropriate that as we look at this as well as the pipeline, and they are somewhat compatible, the two bills together, and I just want to say that I want to work with you to make sure that the bottom line at the end of the day, in fact, all of the pipelines will be safe for carrying this type of material. And
well, let me ask you this, if I might, Mr. Chairman. Can you make a commitment that as this moves on, that this is not the last discussion about pipeline regulation relative to this bill as well?
Mr. Chairman, would you yield to me?
My time for the moment, but absolutely I'll make that commitment. This is not something that's going to go away. We've got time to work on this, again, because as we're looking at the schedule, we're looking for a subcommittee markup before the August break. And I know that the Senate is moving as well, and I look forward to working with the gentlelady in that regard, and want to underscore my support to make sure that the pipeline, no matter what it carries, is going to be safe for every community that it may pass through.
Gentleman, you.
Yield to the gentleman from California.
Well, it seems to me the logical thing to do is to do the pipeline safety bill and not do this one until we've done that legislation, because we want to be sure that the pipeline is safe. And we do have a particularly high corrosive in these tar sands that will be traveling through this pipeline. So rather than just say you'll work with her later on pipeline safety, would the chairman be willing to agree to hold back on this bill, even if it passes the committee, before you move it beyond this committee, until we've resolved the issues on pipeline safety?
Well, I just want to say we've got a couple committees that are involved. They are all beginning to move that process forward. This is more specific in terms of a rifle shot bill, but pipeline safety is not going to go away. We are committed to having a markup in subcommittee before the August break. Transportation Committee, and I don't know that you were in the room when I talked about a discussion that I intend to have with staffs have talked already, and I intend to talk with Chairman Mica later today as it relates to that. And I know that they're planning to move on somewhat of an expedited basis as well.
Gentlemen, yield to me further.
I'll ask I'll ask to stop the clock for a moment. Yes.
Okay. Look, it just seems to me that it makes more sense to build a pipeline right than to have to go and change it after it's already built. And the issue amendment simply says that we should understand the risks before we approve this pipeline, and before the State Department makes a final decision. The Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, should do a study of the hazards posed by the bitumen and evaluate whether the pipeline safety regulations are sufficient to ensure that pipelines carrying tar sands, crude oil don't leak. So let's do that first, and then go with this pipeline to be sure we're doing it safely, rather than go ahead with this pipeline from Canada, find out that it wasn't reviewed by the responsible agency, and they didn't do what they should have done for pipeline safety. So let's put the horse before the cart.
Would the gentleman yield?
My time is expired, so I'm going to yield.
May I be recognized?
It's going to be on this side first.
Okay.
Are the Democrats asking for? Let me go to Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry.
Just appreciate it. Move to strike the last word. The 57 recommendations for this pipeline came from the PHMSA review of the safety. They looked at bitumen as one of the chemicals in there. It has already been reviewed. I don't want to leave an impression here that this already hasn't been reviewed by the agency in charge of making the review. In fact, one of the recommendations was on the steel itself and the thickness of the steel. And so those type of things have already been resolved. So really what we're saying is let's do another PHMSA total review of this. I just wanted to, there was kind of an impression that nobody had looked at these things, and it's already been done. I would proudly yield to the gentlelady from California.
Thank you. Now, my staff has advised me, I'm not a member of our Energy and Power Subcommittee, but they advised me that when Cynthia Quarterman, the administrator of PHMSA, testified before that subcommittee, that they had not done a study analyzing the risks associated with transporting the diluted bitumen. So, and she said that she would be happy to do the study if required by Congress. So maybe
I think what she was
have
saying.
I not been advised correctly?
Reclaiming my time. I think she meant or was talking about the chemical itself and the totality, but they've looked at it in the sense of this pipeline. And based on their review of all of the environmental data and all that was provided to them, then PHMSA came up with 57. But the chemical that they use to help the heavy crude move through is part of what was provided to PHMSA, and PHMSA then based their recommendations on this particular, and I would yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you for yielding to me. There has been experience by running this particular substance into the Midwest. All this bill talks about is the extension of this pipeline down to the Gulf Coast. So we do have a history, and there have been some problems with that pipeline. But again, I think my colleague from California's amendment is concerned. It was a natural gas pipeline, whereas this is not natural gas. This is actually a substance that will be flowing, and there's experience in the Midwest. Granted, I would like to have better pipeline safety laws. I live and work along every pipeline you can imagine in our area, and that's why we have the reauthorization coming up. This will be my third pipeline reauthorization on our committee, and every time we try and make it tougher, but it's still safer in a pipeline than is running down our highways in a tanker truck. And so whether it's natural gas, LNG on a truck, or whether it's this substance on trucks, it's still safer in a pipeline, and we need to do better. But this is this amendment. There have been studies of it because there's been hard experience, and I think.
Okay, well, reclaiming that's good additional information for all of us. Yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Yeah, and Anna's a great friend. There's a huge difference, and my friend from Texas, a huge difference between natural gas and crude oil pipelines. One's explosive, one makes a mess, and we do not want to delay this project when there's really no natural gas applications in this project. And the other part of the debate that my colleague mentioned, I want to make sure that we understood that the Vancouver that he mentioned was not Vancouver, Washington State. It was Vancouver, Canada. This pipeline will be built, and it'll either be built to go to our refineries, or it'll be built to go to terminals that will ship this to China. That is our debate, and that's why we need a decision, because capital will flow where there's certainty, And until there's continued delay, no capital will go to this. And it's already been delayed 15 months. And I yield back to my colleague.
Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentlelady wish to withdraw her amendment, or do we vote to start on the...
I feel like I'm between a rock and a hard place. I don't think that the majority is going to support this amendment, and so while I'm not totally comfortable withdrawing it, I want to use the opportunity to see what we can do together. I'm not convinced that there's been any study of the transport of diluted bitumen. And this is, it really needs, the risks really need to be calculated. So I'll withdraw the amendment, trusting, Mr. Chairman, that we're going to work closely with both you and Chairman Micah, because this is a serious issue. And I don't want any community to have to go through what happened in San Bruno, California. It just is total devastation. So I'll withdraw my amendment in the spirit in which you have described the cooperative work that we're going to do together on an important and serious issue, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I look forward to working with the lady. Amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the bill H.R. 1938 as amended. And we will have a roll call vote on that, so the clerk will call the roll. And let me say then, when we finish the recorded vote, we will adjourn for an hour and come back. So the clerk will call the roll on
Mr.
final
Barton.
passage.
Mr. Stearns. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Mrs. Bono-Mack. Mrs. Bono-Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Bilbray. Mr. Bass. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta, aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers, aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper, aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie, aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson, aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo, aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger, aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Towns. Yep. Mr. Markey. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, nay. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu, nay. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, nay. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, nay. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, nay. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, nay. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, nay. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. What did he say? I'm sorry, he passed him. Oh. Mr. Butterfield, nay. Mr. Barrow. Aye. Mr. Barrow, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, nay. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen, nay. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, nay. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Towns, nay. Mr. Bass, nay.
Take your time on it.
Miriam, don't worry about it. We do it at the end of the markup. On that, there were 33 ayes, 13 nays.
33 ayes, 13 nays. The bill is passed as amended.